He thought it was just another quiet winter morning. A retired Navy SEAL, haunted by wars long over, living alone by the frozen lake of Willow Creek. Then came the cry, faint, desperate, echoing through the snow. Beneath the old bridge he found a German shepherd, half buried in frost, a silver ribbon tied to its collar, and a police badge that should have been lost decades ago. What began as a rescue turned into a revelation. Every step he took with that dog led deeper into the town's forgotten past. A bridge collapse that was no accident, a name erased from history, and a truth powerful enough to break the silence of 50 years. This is the story of a man who thought he'd seen every kind of battle, until he faced the one buried beneath his own hometown. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of courage, love, and the miracles that still rise from the coldest silence. The morning began with the kind of cold that silences even the wind. Frost clung to every pine needle, and the frozen lake of Willow Creek lay still under a blanket of white. Ethan Ward stood outside his cabin, the breath from his lips curling into mist. He had lived alone in this cabin for nearly 5 years, a recluse by choice or perhaps by consequence. A retired Navy SEAL, 42, his body still carried the discipline of combat. Tall, broad-shouldered, short brown hair flecked with gray, a sharp jaw covered in stubble. His face was a map of quiet endurance. The war had left its fingerprints on him, not just in scars, but in silence. There was something about Ethan that made people lower their voices around him. He wasn't unkind, only distant, like someone listening to a sound the rest of the world couldn't hear. That morning, he cradled a steaming mug of black coffee, eyes scanning the pale horizon. He didn't expect company. He never did. The last human voices he'd heard were through the static of a radio broadcast from town, something about a winter storm moving south. But then, faintly, from somewhere beyond the ridge, a sound broke the monotony. A cry, not human, but close enough to stir his instincts, short, sharp, desperate. Ethan froze. He knew that sound. Not the cry itself, but what it meant. Someone, or something, was calling for help. Setting his cup down, he pulled his olive-green field jacket tighter, the old military fabric crackling under the cold. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he moved toward the sound. The wind picked up, howling through the pines, scattering flakes across his path like ghosts. Ethan's heartbeat found a rhythm against the storm, slow, measured, steady. It was the same pace he used to calm himself before breaching a door, before the chaos began. But this time, there was no mission briefing, no team, just instinct. As he crested the ridge, the cry came again, weaker now. He swept his gaze across the frozen landscape until he saw movement, faint, near the old wooden bridge that crossed the creek. He ran, breath burning in his chest, snow lashing his face. Beneath the bridge, half buried in frost and ice, lay a German shepherd. The dog's fur, black and tan, was caked with snow, its ribs faintly visible beneath the coat. One paw twitched feebly. Around its neck hung a silver ribbon, and tied to it, a dull metal badge. Ethan brushed away the frost. The engraving was nearly gone, but he could make out 2 letters. LM. Ethan's throat tightened. The letters stirred a memory. Something from years ago. A report he had half heard on the radio about a missing officer. A tragedy the town had long buried under the comfort of denial. He pushed the thought away and knelt beside the dog. Easy there. he muttered, voice low but firm. You're not dying here. Not today. His gloved hands brushed snow off the animal's body. The dog's eyes fluttered open, deep amber, filled with fear and exhaustion. Yet when they met Ethan's, they steadied, as if recognizing something familiar, a survivor. He took off his jacket, wrapped it around the animal, and lifted it into his arms. The dog was heavier than it looked, muscles rigid with cold, but Ethan carried it with the care of someone used to carrying fallen comrades. The snow grew thicker on the walk back, swallowing his footprints almost as quickly as he made them. Each step reminded him of how long it had been since he had felt responsible for another life. When he finally reached the porch, his arms ached, his breath coming in clouds of white. Inside, he laid the dog near the stove where the fire crackled softly. The warmth filled the room, and slowly, the trembling in the dog's body eased. Ethan rubbed its fur dry with an old towel, then sat back, watching the rise and fall of its chest. "You're one stubborn soul," he murmured, half to himself. The badge glinted faintly in the firelight, and something inside him stirred. Curiosity, unease, a whisper from the past. Hours later, as night settled over Willow Creek, the dog opened its eyes fully and let out a faint, rasping sound, half a whine, half a sigh. Ethan smiled, tired but sincere. "You need a name, don't you?" He glanced toward the window, where the stars hung like shards of ice. "Atlas," he said softly, "because you look like you've been carrying the world on your shoulders." The dog blinked, as if understanding. Outside, the storm began to fade, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt sacred. Inside that silence, Ethan Ward, a man who had spent years running from ghosts, found himself listening to something new, the sound of a heartbeat that wasn't his own. The snow had softened around Willow Creek, blanketing the forest in a deceptive calm. From the window of his cabin, Ethan Ward could see the lake, its surface shimmering faintly beneath the pale morning sun. Inside, the crackle of fire filled the silence. The cabin was small but orderly, the kind of neatness born not of pride, but of a soldier's need for control. Ethan stood near the stove, one hand around a steaming mug, his eyes drifting to the German shepherd resting near the hearth. Atlas had grown stronger over the last few days. His ribs no longer pressed against his fur, and the exhaustion in his amber eyes had given way to something sharper, more aware. He was a magnificent dog, 6 years old, broad-chested, black and tan coat, thick and lustrous now that the warmth had returned to his body. Yet something about him carried the weight of history. He never barked at birds or shadows like most strays. When he did bark, it was sudden, sharp, directed, as though he sensed something Ethan could not. That morning, Atlas was pacing by the window, ears pricked toward the north woods. His tail stiffened, a low growl vibrating in his throat. Ethan followed his gaze but saw only the endless pines, stoic and silent under snow. "It's just the wind, boy," he muttered, though even as he said it, the words felt like a lie. He tried to dismiss the unease. Old instincts stirred too easily, and he had learned long ago not to chase ghosts. But this time, the ghost had a heartbeat. Later that afternoon, while clearing the small shed behind the cabin, Ethan noticed Atlas digging furiously near the wooden floorboards. At first, he smiled, a soldier watching a dog behave like a dog again. "Looking for dinner, huh?" he teased. But the sound of Atlas's claws against wood grew frantic. The dog's breathing turned heavy, and when Ethan stepped closer, he saw the boards had splintered, revealing a patch of rusted metal beneath. "Easy, Atlas," he murmured, crouching beside him. Together they brushed away the snow and dirt until an old iron box emerged, weathered, pitted with rust, edges flaking like burnt paper. The lock gave way with a single pull. Inside were three things: an old black-and-white photograph showing a group of Willow Creek police officers standing beside their patrol cars. The kind of smiling confidence people wore before time humbled them. A torn piece of map with a red X marked along the river bend, and a folded note, the ink faded and trembling. The bridge didn't collapse. It was destroyed. LM. Ethan stared at the initials until his breath caught. LM. The same letters carved on the badge Atlas had been wearing when he found him. His mind went still. Lucille Monroe. The name surfaced like a ghost breaking through ice. He remembered her vaguely, a young officer from the old news reports, missing during the flood of 1982, presumed dead. Her story had haunted the town for months, then vanished under the polite quiet of small-town memory. He glanced down at Atlas, who sat watching him, head tilted, as if waiting for recognition. "Was she your owner?" Ethan whispered. The dog's ears twitched. The question hung between them like the frost outside. Memories stirred, of briefings in the military where silence carried more weight than truth, of men told to forget what they'd seen for the sake of order. Ethan had spent years burying his own ghosts under discipline and distance, but something in that note clawed through his defenses. The bridge didn't collapse. It was destroyed. That single sentence cracked the ice around his heart. He wrapped the items carefully in a cloth and drove to town the next morning, the old pickup groaning against the cold. Willow Creek was small, a handful of snow-covered buildings along Main Street. People waved out of habit more than warmth. When Ethan entered the sheriff's office, the old wooden bell above the door rang weakly. Behind a cluttered desk sat Sheriff Graham, a man in his late 60s, his face carved with lines of worry and resignation. His beard had turned gray, but his eyes were sharp, the kind that had seen too much and learned to say nothing. He looked up, surprised to see Ethan. "Didn't think you ever came to town," Graham said, his voice rough but not unkind. "I found something," Ethan replied, setting the box on the desk. The sheriff peered inside, expression unreadable. When his gaze fell on the note, his hand trembled slightly before he clenched it into a fist. "Where did you get this?" "Behind my cabin. Atlas dug it up." "The dog?" Graham's brow furrowed. "That's impossible." He leaned back, sighing through his nose. "You should let this go, Ethan. Some things are better left under the snow." Ethan studied him for a long moment. "You knew her, didn't you? Lucille Monroe." Graham's eyes flickered, a flash of grief quickly buried under duty. "She was one of ours. Good cop, braver than most. But the flood took her, and that's the end of it." "Then why does her dog have a badge?" Ethan's voice was calm but sharp as broken glass. The old sheriff hesitated, then closed the box gently, his gaze distant. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the truth can drown deeper than the river." Ethan left the office with the box under his arm, the sheriff's warning echoing in his mind. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, relentless. In the passenger seat of the truck, Atlas watched the road ahead, his eyes catching the fading light like molten amber. Ethan glanced at him, a grim smile touching his lips. Looks like neither of us believes in leaving things buried. As the truck rumbled back toward the woods, the sound of the wind rose. Not howling this time, but whispering, as if carrying voices long frozen beneath the ice. The morning broke with a thin veil of fog crawling over Willow Creek, the air heavy with the metallic scent of snow and iron. The lake lay frozen and unmoving, a mirror for a sky that seemed just as lifeless. Ethan Ward zipped his jacket higher as he stepped outside his cabin, the cold biting through the seams of his gloves. Atlas trotted beside him, the German shepherd's breath curling in white wisps. The dog had changed since the night Ethan found him. Stronger now, muscles firm beneath a thick coat of black and tan fur, eyes sharp and intelligent, always watching the horizon as if waiting for something only he could sense. There was a quiet intelligence in his movements, the kind that spoke of training and loyalty long before Ethan entered his life. Ethan glanced down at him, muttering, "You ready to chase ghosts, partner?" He unfolded the torn map they had found in the rusted box. A faded red X marked the river bend where the old Vale Bridge once stood. Ethan remembered it vaguely, a wooden structure connecting the town to the industrial district before a storm took it down in 1982. At least, that's what everyone had been told. The note from Lucille Monroe haunted him. The bridge didn't collapse. It was destroyed. Those words looped through his mind like an echo that refused to die. The drive north took nearly an hour, the truck's tires crunching through layers of snow. As they reached the river, the forest opened into a clearing of gray and silence. What remained of the Vale Bridge was a skeletal ruin, twisted beams of wood and metal jutting from the frozen river like bones from a grave. Ethan stood still for a moment, scanning the wreckage. The air here felt different, thicker, quieter, as if even the wind held its breath. "This is where it happened," he said under his breath. Atlas whined softly, ears pricked, tail stiff. He stepped forward, nose pressed close to the snow near a pile of collapsed boards. Ethan followed, crouching beside the dog. The snow shifted, revealing something dull and metallic buried beneath the frost. He brushed it clean with his gloved hand. A revolver, rusted but unmistakable. The barrel was clogged with dirt, the grip worn smooth. Beside it lay a spent shell casing, half sunken into the ice. The engraving on its side was faint, but Ethan could still read it. 1982. He stared at it, the chill settling deep in his bones. "So there was gunfire," he murmured, "before the bridge went down." The thought stirred something inside him, a mix of anger and reluctant understanding. Years of military service had taught him how easily truth could be buried under convenient lies. He had seen it on distant battlefields, and now he was staring at it in his own backyard. That afternoon, Ethan made his way back into town. The air in Willow Creek carried the faint aroma of smoke and old wood. He parked near the general store, a weather-beaten building that had stood there for as long as anyone could remember. The bell above the door jingled weakly as he entered, the warmth inside a gentle reprieve from the cold. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, a woman in her early 70s with silver hair tied neatly in a low bun. Her posture was frail but dignified, her skin pale and lined from years of mountain winters. She wore a burgundy cardigan and half-moon glasses perched at the edge of her nose. The townsfolk knew her as the keeper of stories, quiet, watchful, and sharp as the edge of a knife when she needed to be. "Ethan Ward," she said, her voice roughened by age and tobacco. "Haven't seen you since your father's funeral." Ethan nodded slightly. "Didn't think you'd remember." "I remember everyone who leaves and everyone who comes back. You're the latter, though I don't know why." Her eyes narrowed. "What brings you here, son?" Ethan set the photograph from the box on the counter. "Do you remember her?" "Lucille Monroe." Mrs. Whitmore's expression faltered for the briefest moment. She looked down at the image. Young faces frozen in monochrome smiles, all wearing Willow Creek police uniforms. Her finger hovered over one woman near the center. Short, athletic build, dark curls framing a determined face. "Lucille was trouble for people who didn't like questions," she said softly. "Bright, stubborn, thought the law was something sacred. She got too close to something she shouldn't have." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. Whitmore's gaze drifted to the window, where the snow pressed thick against the glass. "She found out the town council was laundering money through the river project. She wanted to expose it. Then the floods came and the bridge went down. Everyone said it was an accident, but—" her voice trailed into a sigh. "Not everyone believed that. Some said they saw lights near the bridge that night. Men with tools, and a truck without plates." Ethan clenched his jaw. "And no one did anything?" "People here like their peace," Whitmore replied bitterly, "even if it's built on silence." She leaned closer, her eyes gleaming with something between sorrow and defiance. "Lucille knew too much, Ethan. That bridge didn't kill her. People did." Ethan stood there for a moment, her words settling in the space between them like falling snow. Outside, Atlas barked once, sharp and sudden, his body tense as he stared toward the northern tree line. Ethan turned toward the sound, his heartbeat rising. The wind picked up, sweeping flakes across the road. When he looked back at Mrs. Whitmore, her expression had softened. "You shouldn't go digging too deep," she warned. "The ground in this town doesn't let go easily." Ethan exhaled, pulling a crumpled cigarette from his jacket pocket. "Maybe," he said, striking a match, the flame flickering in his eyes. "But if she fought for justice, I'll finish what she started." He stepped outside into the pale dusk. Atlas was waiting by the truck, tail low, gaze fixed on the dark woods beyond the town. The wind carried the faint creak of the old bridge far in the distance, like the groan of something that refused to stay buried. Ethan took one last drag from his cigarette and flicked it into the snow. "Come on, boy," he said quietly. "We've got ghosts to wake." The forest of Pine Hollow stood like a cathedral of silence, its tall pines whispering in the wind, snowflakes falling through the dim afternoon light. Ethan Ward trudged along the narrow trail, his boots crunching into the frost-hardened ground. The cold had settled deep into his bones, but it wasn't the weather that weighed on him. It was the map in his pocket, the same torn fragment Lucille Monroe had left behind, marked with a red X. Each step closer to that mark felt like walking deeper into someone else's unfinished story. Atlas walked a few paces ahead, his black and tan coat glinting under the faint sunlight. The German shepherd moved with a soldier's focus, nose low, tail steady, muscles tense. He was 6 years old, strong and alert, yet there was a kind of haunted wisdom in his amber eyes, as though he carried memories too heavy for a creature who could not speak. Ethan had stopped thinking of him as just a dog. Atlas was something else, a companion, a compass, maybe even a witness. By late afternoon, they reached the clearing. There, Hidden beneath the towering pines stood a small wooden house, its roof sagging under decades of neglect. The windows were clouded with dust, the porch half collapsed. A faded police seal still clung to the door, cracked and peeling, barely visible under grime. Ethan's breath came out in clouds as he approached. His gloved hand rested on the door handle for a moment, not out of hesitation, but reverence. This place had been forgotten, deliberately. He pushed the door open. The hinges screamed against the silence. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of rot and old paper. Dust motes floated in the weak beam of light from a broken window. Along one wall, rusted filing cabinets leaned like tired soldiers. On the far side of the room, a corkboard still clung to the wall, covered with yellowed reports, faded photographs, and old handwriting, the remains of what must have been a police records room. Ethan's fingers brushed one of the documents. The ink had run, the words illegible. Yet the date, 1982, was still visible. Atlas sniffed the floor, his tail twitching. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though tracing a memory. Then he stopped, pawing at a corner near the desk. The sound of claws against wood broke the stillness. "What is it, boy?" Ethan crouched beside him. The floorboard there was loose, one edge splintered. With the flat of his knife, Ethan pried it up. Beneath lay a small, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and darkened with age. He turned it over carefully, the initials pressed into the leather, faint but legible. L.M. For a long moment, he just stared at it, the initials like a heartbeat beneath his fingertips. Then he opened it. The pages were filled with tight, slanted handwriting, neat at first, then increasingly frantic. Police notes, names, places, dates. Lucille Monroe had been documenting something big. But it was the final page that stopped him cold. The ink there was smeared, the writing shaky, as if written in fear. "They're coming. If I don't return, the truth lies beneath the bridge. Trust the one who bears the mark of the wolf. My dog knows the way." Ethan froze. His breath caught. The mark of the wolf. That was the silver emblem hanging from Atlas's collar, the badge he had found half buried in snow. A pulse of realization rippled through him. Atlas wasn't just a stray who had survived by luck. He had belonged to Lucille Monroe. He was the last piece of her story, the living thread she had left behind. Somehow, through storms and years and silence, the dog had carried her secret until it reached the only man stubborn enough to follow it. Ethan sat back on his heels, the weight of it settling over him. He looked at Atlas, who sat patiently by his side, amber eyes fixed on him with quiet trust. "You knew her," Ethan murmured. "You stayed alive for her." His voice broke into a whisper. "And you brought me here." He could almost feel Lucille's presence in the air, the same cold wind whistling through the rafters, the sound of pine branches tapping the walls like a warning. As night fell, Ethan built a small fire in the stone hearth. The flames flickered across the faded walls, illuminating the dust and shadows like restless spirits. Outside, the wind rose, moaning through the trees, long, hollow notes that sounded like voices calling from afar. He sat beside the fire, the journal open on his lap, tracing Lucille's final words with a gloved finger. Atlas lay nearby, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but still alert to every sound. Ethan reached down and ran his hand along the dog's back, his voice low, steady. "You're not just her guardian, are you?" he said softly. You're her witness. The flames crackled, the words settling between them like an oath. In the distance, the forest answered with a gust of wind that carried through the chimneys, a long, mournful howl that sounded almost human. The thaw came late that year. The air still bit at the skin, but the river no longer slept beneath the ice. Shards of melting frost drifted along the vale, glittering like fragments of broken glass beneath the weak spring sun. Ethan Ward stood on the bank, boots sinking into the slush. His breath came in quiet clouds, his eyes tracing the jagged outline of the half-submerged bridge remains. Months had passed since he had found Lucille Monroe's journal, but the weight of her last words still echoed inside him. The ex-Navy SEAL, broad-shouldered and weathered, carried that same solemn quiet he had brought home from war. His short brown hair was streaked with gray now, his stubble rough as sandpaper. Years of violence had carved deep lines around his mouth and eyes, not of anger, but of reflection. The look of a man who had seen enough death to understand how precious truth could be. And yet, standing there by the thawing river, he felt a spark of the same restlessness that once sent him into battle. Beside him, Atlas waited. The 6-year-old German shepherd had grown into a creature of commanding presence. Thick, black and tan fur, amber eyes alert and unyielding. He stood poised on the riverbank, tail stiff, gaze fixed on the churning water below. For weeks, the dog had seemed uneasy, pacing near the bridge, ears twitching to sounds Ethan couldn't hear. Now, as the ice cracked and drifted, Atlas barked sharply, then stared at a patch of river where something metallic glinted beneath the surface. Ethan followed his gaze, his heart tightening. You found something, didn't you, boy? Without hesitation, he stripped off his jacket, the wind biting through the thin shirt beneath. The water would be near freezing, but hesitation wasn't in his nature. He tied a rope around his waist, anchored it to the bridge's remains, and plunged into the icy current. The shock of cold hit him like a hammer. His breath vanished, muscles clenching. He pushed through the murky depths, guided by the faint reflection below. There it was, a shape caught in the silt and ice. A car. Rusted, collapsed, the white letters barely visible on the side. Willow Creek Police Department. Ethan's pulse quickened. He reached for the driver's side, prying at the half-frozen door until it gave way. Inside, the light from above flickered across the skeletal remains of a body, still strapped in the seat, the bones wrapped in tattered fabric. On the chest, a badge. Ethan brushed the mud away, and the name caught him like a blow. Lucille Monroe. For a long moment, the river went silent. The world above blurred into distant light as he stared at the badge, its silver gleam ghostly beneath the water. Beside the skeleton was a small metal case wedged between the seats. He pulled it free and kicked toward the surface, lungs screaming. When he emerged, the world felt heavier, quieter. Atlas barked wildly from the shore as Ethan crawled onto the rocks, the case clutched in his numb hands. He lay there for a moment, gasping, staring at the open sky. You were right, he whispered. You never stopped fighting. Back in his cabin, the fire roared against the cold. Ethan cracked open the metal case, hands trembling. Inside were stacks of yellowed papers, financial records, letters, and documents stamped with the seal of Willow Creek's town council. Every page told the same story: bribes, falsified contracts, and names. At the top of one letter, written in faded ink, was a signature Ethan recognized from 1,000 town signs. Mayor Charles Lorne, 1982. The same man who had been hailed as a hero for rebuilding the town after the bridge disaster. Lucille hadn't died in an accident. She had been silenced for finding the truth. Word spread quickly. Ethan handed the evidence to the authorities, and for the first time in decades, the town stirred from its long denial. The newspapers called it the Monroe Files. Faces that had hidden behind respectability for years were dragged into the light. There were arrests, confessions. The past, once frozen under ice, was finally forced to breathe again. Weeks later, the bridge was rebuilt, not as a crossing for trucks, but as a memorial, Lucille's Crossing. The plaque bore her name and the words, "For those who carried the truth alone." The ceremony was small, quiet, but the whole town came. Old Sheriff Graham stood at the edge, hat in hand, his face pale with guilt and age. He nodded once to Ethan, the unspoken acknowledgement passing between men who had both seen too much. When the crowd dispersed, Ethan remained. The air was still, the river calm. Atlas stood beside him, tail swaying lightly. Ethan looked out over the new bridge, its wood gleaming pale against the morning sun, and exhaled a breath that felt like release. "Every soul deserves to have its truth heard," he murmured. His voice was steady, low. "And sometimes, the lives we save end up saving us." Atlas tilted his head, then gave a soft bark, the sound echoing gently across the water. A gust of wind carried snow from the pines, scattering it like ash over the new bridge. Ethan smiled faintly. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. As they turned to leave, the sunrise bled gold across the sky. Beneath it, the engraved words on the plaque glimmered faintly in the light. "Even in silence, truth remembers." Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. They come quietly, in the form of a loyal friend, a single act of kindness, or the courage to face the truth. In a world that often forgets compassion, Ethan and Atlas remind us that even from loss, grace can bloom again. The bridge they rebuilt wasn't just made of wood and steel. It was made of forgiveness, loyalty, and faith. Maybe that's how God works. Not always through grand gestures, but through small mercies. A stranger who stops to help, a pet that refuses to give up, or the whisper of conscience that leads us home. Every act of love, no matter how small, ripples farther than we can see. So if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that miracles still walk among us. Leave your thoughts below. Tell us what you believe about faith, loyalty, and second chances. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. Not just to our channel, but to the quiet belief that goodness still wins, even in the darkest winter. May God bless you, and may His light guide every step you take. For even in silence, truth remembers, and love never forgets.